The machete man in the changing room. I'm a woman, now 61 years old, and this story took place in the women's changing room of a gym and pool complex where I'm still a member to this day. At the time, I had been religiously going to the pool 3 times a week as part of my post-pandemic fitness journey, and I was proud of myself for sticking to it. My workouts were paying off, my diet was on track, and everything was going well. I had become familiar with the place, often chatting with a few friends I'd met through my regular visits. That day, there were 4 of us in the changing room. Me, 3 other female friends, and an elderly woman I hadn't seen before. We were getting ready for a swim, laughing and talking as we changed, when we suddenly heard strange noises coming from outside. It sounded chaotic. Loud bangs, muffled shouts, and the frantic thumping of footsteps, like a scuffle was happening. Just beyond the changing room. We all froze mid-change, exchanging nervous glances, unsure of what to do. The noise grew louder, and our eyes darted toward the hallway leading out of the changing room, where the commotion seemed to be getting closer. Then a man burst into the women's changing room, and I'll never forget what he looked like. He was filthy, wearing a tiny pair of blue shorts that looked almost comically short under different circumstances, paired with a stained, sleeveless white shirt that was covered in grime. On his wiry legs, he had these huge brown boots that slammed against the tiled floor as he ran in. His hair was wild and disheveled, and his skin was blotchy, covered in sores and bruises. But the worst part was his eyes. They were crazed, darting around uncontrollably, and there were flecks of foam at the corners of his mouth. He stopped for a second when he saw us, and then let out a guttural, animalistic roar that sent chills down my spine. In his hand was a massive machete, its blade rusted and likely teeming with tetanus. It didn't look particularly sharp, but at that moment it didn't need to. That blade was fear itself. We didn't move. No one did. Just raw. Instinct took over. Freeze, not flee. He charged. Right at me. I stumbled backward into the lockers, a scream erupting from my throat. I braced for impact, for pain, for death, but it didn't come. Instead, a flood of armed police officers burst into the room, weapons raised, voices commanding. The man shrieked, shoved the elderly woman into one of them, and bolted through the showers and out into the pool area. The cop caught the woman, steadied her, and sprinted after the suspect. We heard it all, screams from the swimmers, shouts of, "Get down!" And then a single gunshot. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. We didn't breathe. Eventually, a uniformed officer returned and told us it was safe. We walked out past the front desk, past broken silence, past the man who'd brought chaos into our lives. He was being shoved into a police cruiser, handcuffed, subdued, but still wild-eyed. They said he was on bath salts, that he'd been threatening strangers outside, that we were just a stop on his sprint through madness. No one was hurt, not physically, but we all carried something away from that day. But what do you do after something like that, when the moment has passed and the police are gone, and the adrenaline wears off? What then? For weeks I replayed the moment in my mind, the heat of the tile under my feet, the echo of screams in the pool, the weight of my own breath trapped in my chest. I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak of the hallway outside my bedroom door made my heart jump. I started locking every door, even inside my house. I installed a camera by the front porch, then a second, then a third. I wasn't alone in this. The 3 other women who'd been in the changing room that day, we kept in touch. Before, we'd only talked between workouts or exchanged the occasional wave. But after what we went through, we became something else, survivors of a shared nightmare. We tried to laugh it off at first. One woman joked that she finally had an excuse to skip leg day. Another said she couldn't look at a machete on TV without tensing up. But beneath the surface, we were all raw, shaken in a way we didn't want to admit. One night we met for dinner, not at the gym, not in workout clothes, just as people. And that's when one of the girls, Marla, said it out loud. Think he saw me, really saw me. I think he chose me first. None of us spoke for a moment. We didn't have to, because each of us had thought the same thing. That somehow we'd caught his eye, that in that split second before the police arrived, we were going to die. I started researching him, not obsessively, just trying to understand. I called the Police department citing the incident. They were vague. "We can't release details," they said. "He's undergoing evaluation." Evaluation. That word stuck with me. Was he sick? Was he mentally ill? Was he ever going to be let go? News ran a small blurb the next day. Local man apprehended in public disturbance at health facility. No injuries reported. No mention of the machete. No mention of the changing room. Just a sterile clinical sentence that didn't capture even a shred of what really happened. Couldn't stop myself. I kept looking. Forums, local news, Reddit threads, nothing substantial. But then, like some terrible answer to a question I didn't want to ask, I saw him. He was pushing a mop through the tile floor of a fast food restaurant. He looked calm, clean, normal. But normal doesn't unsee bloodshot eyes. Normal doesn't erase foam from someone's mouth. Normal doesn't change what I know I saw. Was it really him? Maybe, maybe not, but I know fear, I know instinct. And every nerve in my body screamed that it was the same man. After that sighting, I started arriving at the gym armed. Legally, I kept my weapon locked in a locker, but within reach. And I trained, not just swimming, but self-defense. I took classes, I rehearsed scenarios, and above all, I watched people. Watched them closely. Some called me paranoid. Some said I was overreacting, but none of them had been there. None of them had stood half-dressed as a deranged man with a machete screamed into their face. I had survived something primal. And that kind of survival changes you, permanently. Now every time I walk past that changing room mirror, I see someone different, someone who doesn't freeze anymore, someone who remembers everything, someone who will never be caught off guard again. The tragic pool accident. What if a carefree childhood friendship turned into a lifelong nightmare? What if a single moment of cruelty shattered your world forever? In a small English town in 1975, Oliver's idyllic days with his best friend, Tommy, take a dark turn as they step into the unforgiving world of secondary school. In the spring of 1975, Oliver Bennett, was a 12-year-old boy living in a quiet suburban town just outside Manchester, England, a place where the streets were lined with modest brick houses, the air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the community knew each other by name. I was a lanky kid with a mop of brown hair and a knack for getting into harmless mischief, the kind that made adults chuckle rather than scold. My best friend, Tommy Harper, was 11, a year younger than me, and we'd been inseparable since the first day of primary school. We were just normal kids living in England, having met on the very first day of primary school, when I found Tommy playing with action figures on a mat in the corner of our classroom. I still remember that day vividly. I walked into the classroom, nervous about starting school, and there he was, sitting cross-legged on a colourful mat, engrossed in a battle between two plastic soldiers. He looked up, flashed a shy grin, and asked if I wanted to join him. From that moment we were partners in crime, two boys who did everything together, our laughter echoing through the playgrounds and backyards of our little town. From that day forward, we were inseparable, partners in crime who did everything together. We spent our days racing bikes down the hilly streets, building forts in the woods behind Tommy's house, and sneaking into the local sweet shop to buy penny candies with the coins we'd saved up. We thought of ourselves as the leaders of our little group of friends, the popular boys at our small primary school. We thought of ourselves as the popular kids among the boys at our small suburban primary school, always up to some mischief, though nothing too serious. The other kids looked up to us, eager to join in on our adventures, and the teachers often called us cheeky but charming, letting us off with a warning when we got caught climbing the school fence or sneaking an extra biscuit at lunch. Life was simple, filled with the kind of joy only childhood can bring, and Tommy was at the heart of it all. He was small for his age, with a mop of curly blonde hair and a smile that could light up the gloomiest day, the kind of boy who'd share his last sweet with you, even if he really wanted it for himself. But everything changed when we moved up to secondary school that September. In England, there's no middle school. You go straight from primary to secondary, where 11-year-olds like us are thrown into a much larger school with students as old as 16 or 18. In the UK, we don't have middle school. You go straight from primary to secondary, where kids as young as 11 are thrown into a much larger school with students as old as 16 or 18. The transition was jarring, like stepping into a different world. The transition was brutal. Clarky and I went from being the kings of our primary school to tiny, insignificant kids, surrounded by older students who seemed like terrifying giants. We weren't prepared for the sheer size of the school, with its endless corridors, crowded playgrounds, and older students who towered over us like giants. Tommy and I had assumed we'd be in the same classes, clinging to the familiarity of our friendship, but the school had other plans. The school split students into different houses to encourage new friendships, which meant Clarky was in Blue House and I was in Red House, and we didn't share a single class together. I was placed in Red House, while Tommy was in Blue House, and the school system meant we didn't have a single class together. We could only see each other during breaks and lunch, but those fleeting moments weren't enough to shield us from the harsh reality of our new environment. We quickly became painfully unpopular, a stark contrast to our primary school days, and soon became targets for bullying. Overnight, we went from being the popular kids to the outcasts, the small, awkward boys who didn't fit in with the older, tougher crowd. The older students looked at us with disdain, and it wasn't long before we caught the attention of two Year 9 boys, Nathan and Leo, who would become our worst nightmares. Nathan was a hulking brute, broad-shouldered and intimidating, with a cruel streak hidden behind a deceptively simple face. Leo, on the other hand, was leaner, with a sharp tongue, and a malicious glint in his eye that made you feel like he could see right through you. The main bullies were Jake and Jonah, two Year 9 boys who were much older and bigger than us. Together, they made it their mission to torment us, and as the weeks turned into months, I began to dread the sound of the school bell, knowing it meant another day of surviving their cruelty, another day of watching Tommy shrink further into himself, his once bright smile fading with every passing day. What if the bullies you feared most found you at your most vulnerable? What if a place meant for fun became the stage for your worst nightmare? As Nathan and Leo's torment escalates, Oliver and Tommy cling to the fleeting moments of joy that swimming lessons bring. The bullying started small but quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Nathan and Leo seemed to take a perverse pleasure in making our lives miserable, and they were relentless. They'd beat us up, pour glue into our school bags, cut our ties, shove us on the stairs, throw bottles at us, anything to make us suffer. It began with petty taunts. Nathan would mock my scrawny frame, calling me stick boy, while Leo would target Tommy's small stature, sneering that he looked like a little baby who didn't belong in secondary school. But words were just the beginning. They'd shove us in the corridors, their laughter echoing as we stumbled, our books scattering across the floor. They'd pour glue into our school bags when we weren't looking, ruining our homework and textbooks. And once Leo sliced through my school tie with a pair of scissors, leaving it in tatters as a cruel reminder of their power over us. Whether Clarky and I were together or apart, they always found us multiple times a day, tormenting us without ever explaining why they hated us so much. It didn't matter if we were alone or together. They always seemed to know where we were, like predators hunting their prey. They'd wait for us outside the canteen, trip us as we walked to class, or throw empty bottles at us during lunch, their aim unnervingly accurate. Our mere existence seemed to disgust them, and we paid the price for it. I never understood why they hated us so much, but it didn't seem to matter to them. To Nathan and Leo, we were nothing more than targets, weak little boys they could torment for their own amusement. Back then, bullying was much worse than it is now, and Clarky and I grew to dread school. The bullying culture in the 1970s was brutal. There were no anti-bullying campaigns, no counselors to turn to, and the teachers often turned a blind eye, dismissing it as boys being boys. But to us, it was a nightmare we couldn't escape. From September through Christmas, and even into the spring term, our first year at secondary school was hell. The first term was unbearable, and the spring term was even worse. Every day felt like a battle, and I could see the toll it was taking on Tommy. His bright, carefree demeanor faded, replaced by a quiet, anxious boy who flinched at every sudden noise. I wasn't much better. Dark circles formed under my eyes from sleepless nights, and I became withdrawn, my laughter replaced by a constant sense of dread. I don't know how our parents didn't notice anything was wrong, how they didn't see the dark circles under our eyes. or how quiet and withdrawn we'd become. Our parents seemed oblivious to our suffering, never asking why we were so quiet or why we no longer talked about school with the excitement we once had. Back then, snitching was the worst thing you could do. It would lead to a fate worse than death, even among kids who still liked you. The culture at the time was unforgiving. Telling an adult about bullying was seen as a betrayal, a surefire way to make things worse, even among the few kids who still tolerated us. So we kept silent, enduring the torment in secret, hoping it would eventually stop. When the summer term came, we were introduced to something new, the school pool. By the time the summer term arrived, Tommy and I were shells of our former selves, but a small glimmer of hope came when we saw swimming lessons on our schedules. The pool was in a separate building from the main school, a place we'd always known existed, but had seemed reserved for the older kids. It was a separate building from the main school, and we'd always known it was there, but it had seemed like something only the older kids got to use. That summer, the school introduced swimming for Year 7 students, and the entire class was buzzing with excitement. That summer, we saw swimming lessons on our schedules, and the whole class was thrilled. The lessons were split by gender. Boys swam while the girls played netball, and later in the week the girls swam while the boys played cricket. I despised cricket, but swimming was different. Swimming was fun, and more importantly, it meant I finally got to spend some time with Clarky in class again, something we hadn't had since primary school. For the first time since starting secondary school, Tommy and I were in the same class, and it felt like a lifeline, a chance to reclaim a piece of the friendship that had been stolen from us by the school's cruel system. Those swimming lessons became our sanctuary, a brief escape from the torment of Nathan and Leo. For a few precious hours each week, we could laugh and splash around, forgetting the constant fear that had become our daily reality. Tommy's smile returned during those lessons, his eyes lighting up as we raced each other across the pool or dove for coins at the shallow end. But even in those moments of joy, the shadow of our bullies loomed large, a constant reminder that our happiness was fragile, easily shattered by the cruelty that awaited us outside the pool's walls. What if a moment of rebellion led to a tragedy you could never undo? What if the laughter of your best friend turned into a scream of terror? On a fateful Monday afternoon, Oliver and Tommy's decision to linger at the pool takes a deadly turn. The swimming lessons were held every Monday afternoon, the last class of the day, and they quickly became the highlight of our week. For those few hours, Tommy and I could be kids again, splashing in the water, racing each other, and laughing without fear of being overheard by Nathan or Leo. But we were always careful to linger in the changing room after the lesson, waiting until everyone else had left before we showered and changed. One Monday during our swimming lesson, the last class of the day, Clarky and I stayed behind in the changing room after everyone else had left. We had learned early on that the changing rooms were a dangerous place for kids like us, a prime spot for bullies to corner their targets. We often did this to avoid being targeted by bullies, as the changing rooms were a prime spot for attacks. So we'd wait, making sure the coast was clear before we made ourselves vulnerable. That Monday, after the 5th swimming lesson of the term, the other boys filed out of the changing room, their voices echoing down the hall as they headed home. Back then, health and safety rules weren't as strict as they are now. The rules around supervision were lax, and our PE teacher, Mr. Grayson, was more concerned with his own schedule than ours. Our PE teacher, probably in a rush to grab a cigarette or a coffee, handed us the keys to the changing room and asked us to lock up when we were done, then left. He handed me the keys to the changing room, told us to lock up when we were done, and left, likely off to grab a cigarette or a coffee in the staff room. It was a reckless thing to do, leaving 2 12-year-old boys in charge of locking up, but back then adults often trusted us with responsibilities we weren't ready for. Once everyone was gone, Clarky suggested we go back to the pool for a bit. More fun. Tommy turned to me, his eyes sparkling with a hint of the mischief we'd once shared so freely. "Swimming's so much fun," he said, his voice full of excitement. "We're still in our swimming trunks, we could go back in." I hesitated for a moment, knowing we could get in trouble for swimming unsupervised, but the joy on Tommy's face was infectious. I was thrilled to see him so happy, so I didn't hesitate. "Let's do it," I said, a grin spreading across my face. We ran back to the pool area, our bare feet slapping against the tiled floor, and jumped into the water, with a splash. We ran back to the pool area and jumped in, not thinking about the trouble we could get into for swimming unsupervised. We didn't think about the consequences, didn't consider how dangerous it could be without an adult present. Back then, we weren't taught much about the dangers of swimming alone, and as long as we stayed out of the deep end, we figured we'd be fine. We stayed in the shallow end, splashing and laughing, our voices echoing through the empty pool room. A rare moment of freedom in a world that had become so oppressive. Our laughter echoed through the pool room as we splashed around, and I had just surfaced when I heard footsteps. I had just surfaced, wiping water from my eyes, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the changing room. My heart sank, a cold dread washing over me as I turned to see Nathan and Leo walking in, fully dressed in their school uniforms, their polished shoes clicking against the tiles. I turned to see Jake and Jonah walking in from the changing rooms, fully dressed in their school uniforms, shoes and all. They shouldn't have been there. The lesson was over, and they had no reason to be in the pool area. My blood ran cold even in the warm water. The warm water did nothing to stop the icy fear that gripped me, my skin prickling with goosebumps as I realized we were trapped. Clarky whispered something in alarm, but I couldn't make it out. Tommy whispered something, his voice trembling, but I couldn't make out the words over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Well, if it isn't the little idiots," Leo said, his voice dripping with malice, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't the little idiots," Jonah said, his voice dripping with disdain. We were in the middle of the pool, far from the ladders on either side, and Nathan and Leo were standing right in front of the only exit back to the changing rooms. We were in the middle of the pool, far from the ladders, and Jake and Jonah were standing right in front of the only exit back to the changing rooms. There was no way out, no way to escape their gaze, and I knew we were in for something terrible. "Come here," Leo ordered, his tone sharp and commanding. "We're not going to hurt you," Nathan added, but his smirk told a different story. "Come here," Jonah ordered, his tone commanding. "We're not going to hurt you," Jake added, but his voice was far from trustworthy. Leo clapped his hands loudly, lunging forward as if he were about to jump into the pool, making us flinch in fear. "I said, come here," he shouted, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Leo clapped loudly and lunged forward, pretending he was about to jump into the pool, making us flinch. "If you dare, you'll see," Nathan chimed in, his words laced with menace. "If you dare, you'll see," Jake chimed in, his words full of menace. We had no choice but to swim closer to them, our movements slow and reluctant, knowing that whatever they had planned wouldn't end well for us. What if a dare turned deadly in the blink of an eye? What if the sound of a breaking bone became the soundtrack of your nightmares? As Nathan and Leo's dare takes a horrifying turn, Oliver witnesses the unthinkable. As we swam closer to the edge of the pool, my stomach churned with dread, every splash of water feeling like a countdown to something awful. Nathan and Leo stood there, their school uniforms a stark contrast to our dripping swimsuits, their presence an intrusion into the one place we'd thought we could escape them. When we got near the edge, Jonah lifted the grate covering one of the drainage holes along the side of the pool. Leo bent down and lifted the grate covering one of the drainage holes along the side of the pool, a rusty metal cover that was supposed to be bolted down but clearly wasn't. In British pools during the 70s and 80s, these holes were common, and at our school the grates were supposed to be bolted down. In British pools of the 70s and 80s, these drainage holes were standard, designed to keep the water circulating, but at our school, the grates were meant to be secured with bolts to prevent accidents. This one, however, was loose, and Leo held it up with a wicked grin, his eyes glinting with malice. "Dare you to stick your head in the hole," he said, his voice low and challenging, the words sending a shiver down my spine. "Dare you to stick your head in the hole," he said, his voice challenging. I immediately shook my head, my instincts screaming that this was a terrible idea. The hole was narrow, dark, and ominous, the water lapping over the edge as if it were waiting to swallow something whole. "Come on, boys," Nathan said, his tone mockingly friendly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Be cool. We'll be nice to you if you do it. Come on, boys, Jake said, his tone mockingly friendly. Be cool. We'll be nice to you if you do it. I shook my head again, my heart pounding in my chest, but to my shock, Tommy didn't. I immediately shook my head, a sense of danger rising in my chest. To this day, I don't understand why Clarky did it. I've spent decades replaying that moment in my mind, trying to understand why Tommy agreed to the dare. Did he really believe that our worst tormentors would stop bullying us and become our friends if he went through with the dare? Did he actually think Nathan and Leo would stop tormenting us if he proved himself cool in their eyes? Or did he simply not think his head would fit in the hole? Or did he just not realize how dangerous it could be, not thinking his small head would fit in the narrow space? Clarky was very small, even for our age. I was a full head taller than him. Tommy was tiny, even for an 11-year-old, his frame so slight that I towered over him despite being only a year older. Maybe he thought it would be a quick, harmless stunt, a way to finally earn a moment of peace from our tormentors. What's down there? Nathan asked, his voice eager, as if he were genuinely curious about what Tommy might find. What's down there? Jake asked, sounding excited. Just stick your head in and look over the edge, Leo said, his tone casual but laced with something sinister. Just stick your head in and look over the edge, Jonah said. Tommy hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to me as if seeking reassurance, but before I could stop him, he leaned forward, letting his body float up his face angled down into the hole. Clarky complied, letting his body float up so his face angled down into the hole. I watched, frozen, as he dipped his head into the narrow space, his small frame making it just possible for him to fit. Suddenly, Jonah slammed the grate down, pushing Clarky's head deeper into the hole. Without warning, Leo slammed the grate down, forcing Tommy's head deeper into the hole, the metal clanging against the tiles with a sickening thud. Clarky started to flail, splashing water everywhere as he tried to twist and turn to get air, but he couldn't. Tommy immediately started to thrash, his arms and legs flailing in the water, splashing violently as he tried to pull his head free. But the grate held him in place. I screamed, "Let him out!" But Jonah just stood there, his foot on the grate, pinning it down, and laughed maniacally, like some cartoon supervillain. I screamed, "Let him go!" my voice cracking with panic. But Leo just stood there, his foot pressing down on the grate, keeping it firmly in place. He threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, maniacal sound that echoed through the pool room, like a villain from a comic book reveling in his power. Clarky's panic grew, his arms and legs thrashing in the water as he fought to free himself. Tommy's movements grew more desperate, his small body twisting and turning as he fought to free himself, water splashing everywhere as he gasped for air. I couldn't understand how Jonah didn't see what could happen. How could he not realize the danger he was putting Clarky in? I couldn't believe Leo didn't see the danger. How could he not realize what he was doing? Tommy's head was trapped, his air supply cut off, and every second that passed brought him closer to disaster. I lunged forward, trying to reach the grate, but Nathan grabbed my arm, holding me back with a sneer. "Stay out of it, stick boy," he growled, his grip tight enough to bruise. Then we heard a sickening, muffled crack, the worst sound I'd ever heard in my life. Then it happened. A muffled, sickening crack that cut through the sound of Tommy's splashing, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It was the sound of bone breaking, and instantly Clarky stopped moving. It was the sound of bone breaking, a sharp, unmistakable snap that echoed in my ears like a gunshot. Instantly, Tommy stopped moving, his body going limp in the water, his head still caught in the grate at an impossible angle. His body drifted downward, his head still caught in the grate at an impossible angle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, a scream trapped somewhere deep inside me as I realized what had happened. What if a single decision haunted you for decades? What if the silence you chose became louder than any scream? In the aftermath of Tommy's death, Oliver grapples with the weight of his choice and a grief that never fades. The moment I heard that crack, the world seemed to stop. Tommy's body drifted downward, his head still caught in the grate, his limbs floating lifelessly in the water. I knew immediately that the worst had happened. I knew in that instant that the worst had happened. Tommy was gone. Nathan noticed before Leo did, tugging at Leo's sleeve and pointing at Clarky. his face pale with shock. Nathan saw it first, his face turning pale as he tugged at Leo's sleeve, pointing at Tommy with wide, horrified eyes. Leo froze, his face turning white, and he started to shake. Leo froze, his laughter dying in his throat, his face turning as white as a sheet as he started to tremble. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice trembling as if he were about to cry, "Please don't tell anyone." He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice shaking. "Please don't tell anyone," he pleaded, his tone desperate, almost on the verge of tears. There were no threats, no anger, just a desperate plea. There was no malice in his voice, no threat, just a raw, desperate plea for mercy. Then they both ran off. Then they turned and ran, disappearing through the changing room door, leaving me alone with Tommy's lifeless body. I frantically lifted the grate and pulled Clarky free, but it was too late. I lunged forward, my hands trembling as I lifted the grate and pulled Tommy free, but it was far too late. His neck hung limply at an unnatural angle, and I knew he was gone. He had broken his neck trying to free himself. His neck hung at an unnatural angle, limp and broken, and I knew he was gone. He had broken his neck in his desperate struggle to escape. I held him in my arms, crying and shaking, completely at a loss for what to do. I held him in my arms, tears streaming down my face as I shook uncontrollably, my mind a whirlwind of panic and grief, unsure of what to do next. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long. Nathan and Leo returned, bringing Mr. Grayson and another teacher with them. They had clearly gone to get help, which made it obvious they knew what they had done. They had clearly gone to get help, a silent admission of their guilt, though it did nothing to erase the horror of what had happened. In the aftermath, I faced a terrible dilemma. Should I tell anyone that Jonah had essentially killed Clarky, my best friend? In the days that followed, I was consumed by a terrible dilemma. Should I tell the truth that Leo had killed Tommy, my best friend, by holding down the grate? In the end, I decided to stay silent, telling everyone that we had been messing around in the pool, and that Clarky had gotten stuck in the grate during a dare, accidentally hurting himself. I made the choice to stay silent, telling everyone that we had been messing around in the pool, that Tommy had gotten stuck in the grate during a dare and hurt himself by accident. I didn't mention that Jonah had been holding the grate down. I didn't mention that Leo had held the grate down, trapping Tommy until he broke his neck. Maybe that was the wrong choice, but I genuinely believed Jonah was remorseful, and I didn't want to ruin his life. I thought it might be the wrong choice, but I believed Leo was genuinely remorseful, and I didn't want to ruin his life with the truth. Still, I don't think anyone really believed my story. They probably suspected that all three of us, me, Jake, and Jonah, were responsible for Clarky's death. I don't think anyone truly believed my story. Deep down, they probably suspected that Nathan, Leo, and I were all responsible for Tommy's death. Clarky's family never spoke to me or even looked at me again. Tommy's family cut me out of their lives completely, unable to speak to me or even look at me, their grief too raw to face the boy who had been with their son when he died. My own parents struggled to look at me for a while, though they never directly blamed me. My own parents struggled to look at me for months, their eyes filled with a quiet sorrow, though they never directly accused me of anything. After the incident, the bullying stopped completely, not just from Jake and Jonah, but from everyone. After Tommy's death, the bullying stopped entirely, not just from Nathan and Leo, but from everyone at school. Some kids even started looking at me with a mix of fear and awe, maybe because they thought I was capable of something terrible, or maybe because Jake and Jonah had warned others to leave me alone. Some kids began to look at me differently, a mix of fear and awe in their eyes, perhaps thinking I was capable of something terrible, or perhaps because Nathan and Leo had warned others to steer clear of me. I'm not sure which. I never found out which it was. Now, nearly 50 years later, I still miss Clarky every single day. Now, nearly 50 years later, I still miss Tommy every single day, his laughter and kindness a constant presence in my memories. He was the sweetest, kindest boy, who only wanted to be liked, but he died so tragically. He was the sweetest, kindest boy, who only wanted to be liked, but he died in the most tragic way imaginable. I never looked into what became of Jake and Jonah after they left that school, but I hope they made something good of their lives, so my decision to stay silent wasn't in vain. I never sought out what became of Nathan and Leo after they left that school, but I hope they made something good of their lives, so my decision to stay silent wasn't for nothing. Clarky's death has haunted me my entire life, and every time I think about it, I still feel a deep pain and guilt that never goes away. Tommy's death has haunted me for decades, and every time I think about it, I'm overwhelmed by a deep pain and guilt that never fades, a wound that time has never healed. The disturbing incident at the school pool in the early 1990s, a seemingly innocent charter school in Minnesota, hid a dark underbelly where a disturbing incident at the pool would leave a lasting scar on my childhood. My name is Ben, at least that's the name I'll use for this story, though it might not be my real one, a precaution to shield myself from the shadows of a past I'd rather leave behind. My name is Ben, at least that's the name I'll use for this story, though it might not be my real one. This happened in the early 1990s when I was 5 years old, a time when the world felt both vast and small, and I was attending a charter school in Minnesota, USA, a place that would shape some of my earliest, most unsettling memories. This happened in the early 1990s when I was 5 years old, attending a charter school in Minnesota, USA. Back then, charter schools were just starting to gain popularity, a new frontier in education that promised innovation, and my parents, eager for something different, decided to enroll me in a newly opened one that had been converted from an old mansion, its grand architecture a stark contrast to the modern schools of today. Back then, charter schools were just starting to gain popularity, and my parents decided to enroll me in a newly opened one that had been converted from an old mansion. In my memory, the school was a damp, musty place, the air heavy with the scent of mildew, its walls steeped in history that felt more oppressive than nostalgic, housing only a small number of students, which made every creak and whisper echo through the halls. In my memory, the school was a damp, musty place with only a small number of students. The younger kids like me were on the first floor, our classrooms bright with colorful posters, but always a little too cold, while the older kids had their classrooms on the second floor, their laughter drifting down the stairwell during breaks. The younger kids like me were on the first floor. The older kids had classrooms on the second floor. The teachers' rooms were on the third, and there was an attic above that. The teachers' rooms were on the third floor, a place we rarely ventured, and above that was an attic, a shadowy space I vaguely recall visiting once or twice, perhaps for a Christmas event, though thinking about it now makes me feel uneasy, a creeping discomfort I can't quite place, like a memory I've buried too deep to unearth. I vaguely recall being in the attic once or twice, maybe for a Christmas event, but thinking about it now makes me feel uneasy, though I can't quite place why. The school was run by a strange family, the Howes, whose presence cast a peculiar shadow over the institution, their oddities as much a part of the school's atmosphere as its creaking floors and peeling wallpaper. The school was run by a strange family, the Howes. The principal, Mrs. Howe, bore an uncanny resemblance to Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, so much so that they could have been twins, her stern demeanor softened only by occasional, unexpected kindnesses that left me puzzled. The principal, Mrs. Howe, looked exactly like Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, so much so that they could have been twins. She was usually strict, her voice sharp enough to quiet a room with a single word, but occasionally she'd be unexpectedly kind, especially to me, a favoritism I never understood. She was usually stern, but occasionally she'd be unexpectedly kind, especially to me. One year she gave me a Christmas present, a small toy car wrapped in red paper, something none of the other kids at school received, a gesture that made me feel special but also uneasy, as if I were part of a game I didn't understand. One year she gave me a Christmas present, which none of the other kids at school received, and I never understood why. Her husband, Mr. Howe, was an odd man, tall and lanky, with thinning hair that clung desperately to his scalp and watery, wet-looking eyes that always seemed to glisten unnaturally, giving him an unsettling, almost reptilian appearance. Her husband, Mr. Howe, was an odd man, tall and lanky, with thinning hair and watery, wet-looking eyes. He mumbled and stuttered when he spoke, his words often lost in a nervous jumble, but when he got angry, he transformed into something terrifying. His face would turn a deep red, his eyes bulging as if they might pop from their sockets, and he'd yell in a way that sent us scattering, our small bodies trembling with fear. He mumbled and stuttered when he spoke, but when he got angry, he'd become terrifying. His face would turn red, his eyes would bulge, and he'd yell in a way that scared us all. We were frightened of him, but there was something more, a visceral disgust that clung to him like a second skin, as if there was something inherently unclean about him, a feeling I couldn't articulate as a child, but that lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. We were frightened of him, but also oddly disgusted by him, as if there was something inherently unclean about him, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was at the time. The Howes had 3 children, each as peculiar as their parents, their presence, adding to the school's strange atmosphere, like characters in a story that didn't quite fit the setting. The Howes had 3 children. The youngest, whom I'll call Wally, was in my class, a clumsy, gangly kid who likely had special needs, his cheerful demeanor a bright spot in the otherwise dreary school, until he inevitably hurt himself in some accident. The youngest, whom I'll call Wally, was in my class and likely had special needs. He was always cheerful, his laughter echoing through the classroom until he'd trip over a chair or crash into a desk, sending everything flying, at which point he'd cry loudly. For a while his wails a familiar sound that marked his every entrance. He was a clumsy, gangly kid who was always cheerful, until he inevitably hurt himself in some accident, at which point he'd cry loudly for a while. You always knew when Wally was entering the classroom, the chaos of his arrival, a symphony of clattering desks and chairs, a whirlwind of motion that left us both amused and exasperated. You always knew when Wally was entering the classroom because he'd crash through desks and chairs, sending everything flying. The Howes' strangeness pulsed, a shadow weaving through the school, its silver edge glinting with unease, a presence. That wasn't just a family, wasn't just a staff, but something alive, something that loomed with a hunger for control, whispering promises of danger as I walked the halls. The House children cast an unsettling shadow over the school, and as I navigated its eerie grounds, an encounter at the newly renovated pool would reveal the true danger lurking within this strange family. The Howe's middle child was a teenage girl, probably in high school, who only appeared occasionally for school events or on weekends when her parents dragged her along, her presence a fleeting mystery to us younger kids. The middle child was a teenage girl, probably in high school, who only showed up occasionally for school events or weekends when her parents dragged her along. She had a typical 1990s goth look, black eyeliner, pale skin, and a wardrobe of dark, baggy clothes that made her stand out against the school's faded pastel walls, a figure who seemed more like a ghost than a student. She had a typical 90s goth look, and as a little kid, I didn't know much about her. She was just there. As a little kid, I didn't know much about her. She was just there, a silent observer whose rare appearances left me curious but distant, her world too far removed from mine to understand. The oldest child, Dom, was in his early 20s, having recently graduated from college, and what was strange was how often he was at the school, his constant presence a puzzle that felt wrong even to my young mind. The oldest child, Dom, was in his early 20s and had recently graduated from college. What was strange was how often he was at the school. Looking back, it's bizarre that the principal's adult son was always hanging around an elementary school, a detail that would raise red flags today, but seemed to go unquestioned then. Looking back, it's bizarre that the principal's adult son was constantly hanging around an elementary school. He was at every event, sports day, the Christmas festival, the bake sale, and even during regular school weeks, his tall, looming figure, a constant shadow in the hallways, his presence unsettling in a way I couldn't articulate as a child. He was at every event, sports day, Christmas festival, bake sale, and even during regular school weeks. I don't know if I'm exaggerating his presence in my memory, but it always felt like he was there, watching, a feeling that grew more disturbing with time. I don't know if I'm exaggerating his presence in my memory, but it always felt like he was there, looming around, which was unsettling even for a kid who didn't fully understand why. The school had an outdoor pool located in a forested area near the playground and sports field, a feature that had sparked excitement when I first saw it, though that excitement quickly turned to disappointment. The school had an outdoor pool located in a forested area near the playground and the sports field. In my first year there, we never used the pool, a letdown for all of us kids who had dreamed of splashing around on hot days. The pool left uncovered and neglected, filled with leaves, branches, insects, and foul, stagnant water that gave off a rancid smell. In my first year there, we never used the pool, which disappointed all of us kids after we'd been so excited to see it when we first started. It was always uncovered, filled with leaves, branches, insects, and foul, stagnant water. Instead of getting a cover or hiring a cleaner, the school instilled a deep fear in us about going near it, threatening severe punishment if we did, warning that it would be dangerous if anyone fell into the murky, debris-filled water. Instead of getting a cover or hiring a cleaner, the school just instilled a deep fear in us about going near it, threatening severe punishment if we did, since it would be dangerous if anyone fell in. In the second year, during a particularly hot summer that started in early May, the school finally hired people to clean and renovate the pool, adding a proper cover, a change that felt like a small victory for us kids. In the second year, during a particularly hot summer that started in early May, the school finally hired people to clean and renovate the pool, adding a proper cover. It was a big deal. Everyone was thrilled to finally use the pool again, our excitement palpable, as we imagined the cool water on swelteringly unbearable days. It was a big deal. Everyone was thrilled to finally use the pool again. We had swimming lessons supervised by our teachers, and there was a recreational swim club on Thursdays where we could play with floaties and toys, the laughter of children echoing through the forested area. A rare moment of joy in the school's otherwise oppressive atmosphere. We had swimming lessons supervised by our teachers, and there was a recreational swim club on Thursdays where we could play with floaties and toys. The changing rooms were two small shacks under the tree line, one for boys, one for girls, old, and filthy structures that likely dated back to the mansion's original use, their condition a testament to the school's neglect despite its high tuition fees. The changing rooms were two small shacks under the tree line, one for boys, one for girls. They were old and filthy, likely dating back to whatever the building had been before it became a school. Despite being a fairly expensive charter school, they didn't seem to spend much on upkeep. The changing rooms, a grim reflection of their priorities, wooden benches were splintery, spiders and other insects scurried across the walls, and the whole place felt grimy, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Despite being a fairly expensive charter school, they didn't seem to spend much on upkeep. The changing rooms were in terrible condition. Wooden benches were splintery, spiders and other insects were everywhere, and the whole place felt grimy. Because of this, we often wore our swimsuits to school under our clothes to avoid changing there, a small act of rebellion against the discomfort of those shacks. Because of this, we often wore our swimsuits to school under our clothes to avoid changing there. The school also had a strict rule against locking any doors, a policy born from an incident where a kid got stuck in a bathroom stall for an entire lunch break and had a panic attack, leading them to ban locks rather than fix them, a decision that left us vulnerable in ways we didn't fully understand. The school also had a strict rule against locking any doors, ever since a kid got stuck in a bathroom stall for an entire lunch break and had a panic attack. Instead of fixing the locks, they just banned us from locking doors to prevent anyone from getting trapped. So we never locked the changing rooms, even though they had old bolt-style locks, a detail that would soon prove to be a dangerous oversight. So we never locked the changing rooms, even though they had old bolt-style locks. The school's neglect pulsed, a danger weaving through its walls, its silver decay glinting with menace, a presence that wasn't just a building, wasn't just a rule, but something alive, something that exposed with a hunger for vulnerability, whispering promises of harm as I stepped into the shack. A terrifying encounter with Dom in the changing room unleashed a swarm of wasps and a chilling revelation about the Howe family, leaving me with a haunting gratitude for my narrow escape. This is why Dom, the principal's adult son I mentioned earlier, could just walk into the boys' changing room without warning. his presence a violation that went unquestioned in the lax oversight of the school. This is why Dom, the principal's adult son I mentioned earlier, could just walk into the boys' changing room without warning. I don't know why he, of all people, was tasked with checking on us to make sure we were changed and ready for swimming, his role an unsettling intrusion that felt wrong even to my young mind. I don't know why he, of all people, was tasked with checking on us to make sure we were changed and ready for swimming. Sometimes he'd even supervise us in the pool, standing on the sidelines with a watchful gaze. But again, he wasn't a teacher, just the principal's son, a fact that would be unthinkable today but was somehow acceptable in the early 90s at a charter school. Sometimes he'd even supervise us in the pool, but again, he wasn't a teacher, just the principal's son. That kind of thing wouldn't fly today, at least I hope not. But back then it was apparently fine, a lapse in judgment that left us vulnerable to his whims. That kind of thing wouldn't fly today, at least I hope not. But in the early 90s, at a charter school it was apparently fine. Dom made a habit of bursting into the changing room and shouting "boo" to scare us, a cruel game he thought was funny. His laughter echoing in the small space as we flinched, our small bodies tensing with fear. Dom made a habit of bursting into the changing room and shouting "boo" to scare us, which he thought was funny. He didn't do it to the girls, a small mercy, but even so I never liked it. The sudden intrusion, a jolt that left me on edge, my heart racing each time he appeared. He didn't do it to the girls, but even so I never liked it. Back then I struggled to vocalize discomfort or fear, my voice too small, too timid to protest, so I never said anything, even though his actions always made me uneasy, a feeling that gnawed at me like a splinter I couldn't remove. Back then I struggled to vocalize discomfort or fear, so I never said anything, even though it always made me uneasy. One particular day, near the end of the school year, it was blisteringly hot, a sweaty, miserable day that left us all sluggish, the air thick with humidity as we longed for the cool relief of the pool. One particular day, near the end of the school year, it was blisteringly hot, a sweaty, miserable day, and I was dragging my feet while changing after a swim session. My friends already out at the pool, their laughter faint in the distance as I lingered in the changing room, cursing my forgetfulness. My friends had already changed and were out at the pool, but I hadn't remembered to wear my swimsuit from home, so I had to fully change in the room. A task I dreaded in the grimy shack, its splintery benches and spider-filled corners, a far cry from the comfort I craved. I was halfway through changing, standing there in my underwear, vulnerable and exposed, when the door creaked open, the sound a slow, ominous groan that sent my heart racing. I was halfway through changing, standing there in my underwear, when the door creaked open. "Boo," Dom said, his voice quieter than usual, a sinister edge to it that made my blood run cold, my heart immediately pounding in my chest. "Boo," Dom said, his voice quieter than usual. My heart immediately started pounding. I had only been alone with Dom once before in the attic the previous Christmas, where his presence had made me feel deeply uncomfortable and scared, a memory that came rushing back now, the same dread flooding my small body. I had only been alone with Dom once before, in the attic the previous Christmas, and he had made me feel deeply uncomfortable and scared then, so the same feeling came rushing back now. "Hurry up, Ben," he said, his tone commanding, a sharpness in his voice that made me shrink back, my hands clutching my swim trunks in front of me, trying to cover myself. "Hurry up, Ben," he said, his tone commanding. I expected him to leave, to give me the privacy any child deserved, but he didn't. The door swung shut behind him with a dull thud, and he just stood there, arms crossed, watching me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I expected him to leave, but he didn't. The door swung shut behind him, and he just stood there, arms crossed, watching me. The only way to put on my trunks was to do it in front of him, a prospect that filled me with a cold dread I'd never felt before, a primal fear that rooted me to the spot, my small body trembling as I stood there, exposed and powerless. I was holding my swim trunks in front of me, trying to cover myself, and the only way to put them on was to do it in front of him. I felt a cold dread in my stomach, a feeling I'd never experienced before. I didn't want to change in front of him, but he was an adult, the principal's son, and I didn't want to get in trouble by saying anything, the fear of authority outweighing the fear of what he might do. I didn't want to change in front of him, but he was an adult, the principal's son, and I didn't want to get in trouble by saying anything. Instead, I turned my back to him, my hands shaking as I quickly slipped the trunks up my legs, trying to get it over with as fast as possible, my movements jerky with panic. Instead, I turned my back to him and quickly slipped the trunks up my legs, trying to get it over with as fast as possible. Suddenly, I felt his hands on my shoulders, a cold, firm grip, as he shouted, "Boo!" again, the sound a jarring explosion in the small space. Suddenly, I felt his hands on my shoulders as he shouted, "Boo!" again. I hadn't heard him approach, and in that split second, imagining him sneaking up on me while I was vulnerable, a wave of fear washed over me like nothing I'd ever felt, a terror so raw it stole my breath. I hadn't heard him approach, and in that split second, imagining him sneaking up on me while I was vulnerable, a wave of fear washed over me like nothing I'd ever felt. Dom's grip pulsed, a terror weaving through the shack, its silver claws glinting with malice. A presence that wasn't just a prank, wasn't just a game, but something alive, something that hunted with a hunger for fear, whispering promises of harm as I froze in his grasp. The pool party. Intrusion. A night of terror in. The chaotic climax of a late summer night in 2018, my friend Kelly turned our pool party into a battlefield, smashing a lamp into the face of an intruder named Chad, blood pouring from his cheek as she wielded a golf club to drive him and his accomplice Brad away. A desperate act that saved us from 3 menacing strangers, but left me with a fear of the water I've never shaken. Chad's scream echoed through the yard as he staggered back, a shard of glass embedded in his face, while Kelly's swing of the golf club cracked Brad's forearm, sending them fleeing through the gate, leaving their third accomplice, Vlad, to be tackled by a neighbor. Kelly ran back into the yard, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. We joined in, shouting as loud as we could, and Kelly charged at Brad, swinging something she'd grabbed from inside. It was one of the golf clubs Dana's boyfriend, Chris, always left lying around. Her bravery a turning point in a night that had spiraled into terror, a night that would haunt us long after the police arrived. I'm a 28-year-old graphic designer now, but back then, I was a 21-year-old med school hopeful, just trying to unwind with friends at a pool party in our suburban backyard. A night that turned into a nightmare I'll never forget, a night that changed me forever. It was late summer and I was at the house I shared with 4 other girls, Kelly, Claire, Dana, and Janet, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place we'd made our own as college students trying to navigate the chaos of our early 20s. I was 21 years old at the time of this story, a college student preparing to start med school. It was late summer, and I was at a small pool party with 3 of my friends, Kelly, Claire, and Dana, at the above-ground pool in the backyard of the house we shared. The pool, a simple above-ground unit, bigger than a hot tub but without jets or heating, a perfect spot for us to splash around and unwind after a grueling year of studying, work, and personal drama. Janet wasn't home that night. She was at work, leaving the 4 of us to enjoy a rare moment of carefree fun, our laughter echoing through the yard as the sun set over the forest at the edge of our property. We'd been drinking cocktails for an hour or 2, the glasses lined up on the side of the pool, the faint smell of barbecue wafting over from our neighbors, the Petersons, whose lively party had quieted down by 10 p.m., leaving the night calm, peaceful, the soft music we played, mixing with the distant hum of their tunes. It was around 10 p.m., maybe a bit earlier, and we'd been drinking cocktails for an hour or 2, feeling relaxed and carefree. The sun was setting over the forest on the edge of our property, and the mouth-watering smell of a barbecue from our neighbors, the Petersons, wafted over, the setting a perfect backdrop for a night of relaxation, a night we thought would be nothing but laughter and memories, a night that would soon turn into a fight for our safety, a fight that would leave us scarred in ways we couldn't have imagined. We were kicking back, sipping our drinks, the water cool against our skin, our bikinis a symbol of the carefree vibe we'd been chasing, when the back gate creaked open. A sound that didn't alarm us at first. Our house was a popular hangout, and friends often let themselves in through the gate if they heard us in the yard. But as I turned to look, the expressions on Kelly and Claire's faces told me something was wrong. Their voices sharp with suspicion, a suspicion that would soon turn to fear, a fear that would change everything in the blink of an eye. The arrival of the strangers turned our peaceful pool party into a tense standoff, their menacing presence and cryptic threats planting the seeds of fear that would soon erupt into chaos. I turned in the pool, my back to the gate, to see three guys strolling into our yard. Their college-aged frat boy demeanor, cocky strides, smug grins, setting off alarm bells in my head, a sinking feeling that we were in trouble, a feeling I couldn't shake even before they spoke. I turned around in the pool and saw three guys strolling into the yard, looking like typical college-age frat boys, walking with the kind of confidence that set off alarm bells in my head, their presence so out of place, so unwanted, that I glanced at Kelly and Claire, their faces confirming what I already knew. They didn't recognize these guys either, their expressions a mix of confusion and suspicion, a mix that mirrored my own growing unease. Dana, ever the diplomat, spoke first, her voice polite but cautious. "Can we help you guys?" The guy in front, I'd later nickname him Chad, flashed a grin that felt predatory, his eyes roaming over us in a way that made my skin crawl, his tone too smooth, too casual. We were just in the area, thought we'd swing by. Kelly, always the smartass, didn't hesitate, her voice sharp. "Well, you should swing right back out the way you came." Chad laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves, as if her defiance amused him, as if he'd expected it, as if he enjoyed it, his laughter a warning of the danger we were in, a danger that was only just beginning to reveal itself. I tried to keep my voice steady, hoping to diffuse the situation. "Seriously, are you looking for Janet?" The three exchanged a quick look, a silent communication that sent a chill down my spine, before the bigger guy in the back, Brad as I'd call him, spoke. "Yeah, Janet." They introduced themselves with names I don't remember, probably fake anyway, so I've always called them Chad, Brad, and Vlad when I tell this story, just to add a bit of humor to an otherwise horrific experience. Their name's a small act of defiance in my memory, a way to reclaim some control over a night that had spiraled out of my grasp, a night that would soon turn violent, a night that would leave us fighting for our safety, for our lives. "Janet's at work," I told them, my voice tight. "I'm not sure when she'll be back." Chad's grin widened, his tone chilling. "That's fine, we'll wait." Claire, her suspicion clear, pressed further. "Why are you looking for Janet?" Brad's response was vague, ominous. "Oh, you know, she owes us." A statement that didn't make sense. Janet was the most responsible of us, the least likely to owe anyone anything, especially not to guys like these. Her absence a small mercy in a night that was quickly turning dark. A night that would soon force us to confront a threat we couldn't have anticipated. A threat that would push us to our limits. The strangers' threats escalated as they trapped us in the pool, their actions turning predatory. Their menace a suffocating weight that left us desperate for a way out, a way to survive. I pressed further, my voice shaking but determined. "Owes you what?" Chad stepped closer to the edge of the pool, his tone turning colder, his words a threat wrapped in a sneer. "She owes us, but if you're so inclined, any of you can pay on her behalf." His suggestion dripping with menace, a suggestion that made my stomach churn, a suggestion that confirmed the danger we were in. Chad stepped closer to the edge of the pool, his tone turning colder. "She owes us, but if you're so inclined, any of you can pay on her behalf," he said, his words dripping with menace, his eyes roaming over us in our bikinis, the outdoor. Lighting making us feel exposed, vulnerable, the kind of vulnerability that made my heart race, that made me strain to hear if the Petersons were still in their yard, if help was near, if we could escape. That's when I noticed Vlad, the quietest of the three, had silently removed the ladder from the pool, trapping us inside. The above-ground unit now a prison, the only way out a clumsy climb over the side, a fall to the grass that would leave us exposed, humiliated, defenseless. That's when I noticed something alarming. Vlad, the quietest of the three, had silently removed the ladder from the pool, making it impossible for us to get out easily, the realization hitting me like a punch, my breath catching as I saw the trap they'd set. their control over us a suffocating weight, a weight that grew as they started circling the pool, their eyes on us, their movements coordinated, rehearsed, a predator's dance that made it clear they were enjoying this, that they wanted us to feel the fear, to feel the power they held over us. Chad began teasing Claire, the shyest of us, trying to dunk her under the water, his hands on her as she screamed, "Get off me! Don't touch me!" Her voice a mix of fear and defiance, her boyfriend's absence of vulnerability Chad exploited with a feigned offense. "Chill out, babe, I'm just having fun." Dana, desperate to escape, tried to pull herself over the side, but Vlad darted over, shoving her back into the water with a hard push, the splash echoing as I shouted, "Don't push her!" Chad's face turned serious, his voice low, threatening. "I suggest you shut up." His words a blade that cut through the night, a blade that matched the switchblade he pulled from his pocket, its gleam a promise of violence, a promise that left us trembling in the water. I turned to Kelly, who'd been unusually quiet. Kelly, the loudest, the most confident of us, her silence a red flag in a night already filled with them. "Kelly, do you know these guys?" I asked, my voice a whisper, hoping for some explanation, some connection that might diffuse the situation. She shook her head, her face pale. "No, I don't." But Chad's voice cut through, chilling. "So it's you." His words aimed at Kelly, his accusation a puzzle we couldn't solve, a puzzle that would soon reveal the true nature of their threat, a threat that would push us to the edge, a threat that would force us to fight for our lives. The revelation of their connection to Pete turned the night into a nightmare of violence. Chad's threats and the switchblade a terrifying reality that left us fighting for our freedom, for our survival. Chad's accusation hung in the air, his voice cold as he turned to Kelly. "She's the one seeing our good friend Pete," a statement that sent a jolt through me, the pieces falling into place. Kelly had recently started dating Pete, a laid-back stoner we'd all met, a guy Dana and Janet didn't like, but I'd thought was harmless, a guy who now seemed to be the key to this nightmare. Chad turned to her, his voice chilling. "So it's you." "What's me?" Dinah asked. "She's the one seeing our good friend Pete," Chad said, his words a revelation that tied this intrusion to something darker, something tied to Pete, something that would soon turn violent, something that would test us in ways we couldn't have imagined. "You're friends with Pete?" Kelly asked, a flicker of relief in her voice, hoping for a connection that might save us, but Chad sneered. "He wishes," his tone turning darker. "Pete owes us a lot of money, and we thought the other girl was his piece, but if it's you, maybe you can pay the debt." "How much?" Kelly asked, her face pale, the question a desperate attempt to understand, to find a way out. Chad's grin was cruel. $20, he said before bursting into laughter with Brad, their cackles grating as he corrected himself. "No, he owes us some serious cash, babe. 5 grand. A number none of us could fathom. A number. That turned our fear into panic. A number that made it clear we were in over our heads. "What the hell does Pete owe 5 grand for?" Kelly demanded, her voice sharp, and Chad made an exaggerated sniffing sound, rubbing his nose. "This and that." His gesture a clear hint. Drugs, heavier than the weed Kelly had bought from Pete, cocaine or MDMA, a debt that explained their presence, their menace, their switchblade. Chad made an exaggerated sniffing sound, rubbing his nose. This and that, the realization hitting me like a wave. Pete wasn't just a stoner, he was a dealer, caught in a web we'd been pulled into. A web that now threatened our lives, that now held us captive in our own pool, that now demanded payment in ways we couldn't give, in ways that made my skin crawl as Chad's next words confirmed my worst fears. "Either you pay us yourselves, or you get Pete over here to settle his debt. Or maybe you girls can pay us back some other way," Chad said, his tone suggestive. Brad's leer aimed at me, making my stomach churn. His suggestion a violation that left us reeling, a threat that left us trapped. "Either you pay us yourselves or you get Pete over here to settle his debt. Or maybe you girls can pay us back some other way," Chad said, his tone suggestive, his words a promise of violence, of violation, a promise that sent Claire scrambling to the other side of the pool, only for Vlad to grab her by the hair, yanking hard, his hand clamping over her mouth as she screamed, Chad's voice a growl. "Someone better make a decision soon, or we're really going to hurt this one." Claire's tears a breaking point, a moment that pushed us to act, to fight, to survive. Kelly's fierce resistance turned the tide, driving the intruders away. But the aftermath left us scarred, a night of terror that reshaped our lives, a fear that lingers in the water I can no longer face. Kelly, her face pale but determined, spoke up. "I can go call Pete." A plan forming in her mind, a plan I feared as I whispered, "Kelly, don't." But she replied, "I'll call Pete, it'll be fine." Her words a lie, her eyes betrayed, her fear a mirror to my own as Chad helped her climb out of the pool, his grip tight on her arm as he led her to the sliding glass door of the house. Chad helped Kelly climb out of the pool, gripping her arm tightly as he led her to the sliding glass door of the house. The moment a tense pause, a breath before the storm, a storm that broke when a loud shattering crash echoed through the yard. Kelly grabbing a lamp from inside and smashing it into Chad's face, his scream a bellow of pain as blood poured down, a shard of glass in his cheek, a moment of chaos that gave us our chance. We joined in, screaming for help, our voices a desperate plea as Kelly charged at Brad with a golf club, cracking his forearm with a sickening thud, his cry of pain a signal for Chad to bolt. Ripping open the gate and fleeing, Brad stumbling after him, leaving Vlad dumbfounded, frozen, until Mr. Peterson and his friends rushed in, one of them, an off-duty cop, tackling Vlad to the ground, pinning him like a pro wrestler, a dramatic end to a night of terror. Seconds later, Mr. Peterson and a couple of other men from the neighboring yard rushed in, confused but immediately checking on us. "They're getting away!" Kelly screamed, pointing at the gate, her voice a call to action. A call that brought help, that brought safety, that brought an end to the nightmare, but not to the fear, not to the scars, not to the memories that would haunt us for years. Police arrived, and we told them everything. Their investigation revealing the intruders were juniors at our college, identified by Pete, who denied owing them anything but couldn't escape the connection. Drugs, a debt, a world we'd been pulled into without knowing. We called the police and told them everything. They spoke to Pete, who denied owing the guys anything, but was able to identify them. They were juniors at our college, the aftermath a blur of legal battles, assault charges complicated by the injuries. Chad and Brad sustained, a settlement out of court that felt hollow, their families' money shielding them from jail but not from expulsion. Probation, consequences that didn't feel like enough, that didn't erase the fear, the violation, the night that had changed us. We stayed in the house until the lease ended, then moved out. Kelly and I staying close, Claire, Dana and Janet, drifting away, the trauma a wedge between us, a memory we couldn't share, couldn't face together. Kelly and Pete surprisingly stayed together, eventually marrying, having a child, becoming nurses. A happy ending I never expected, a testament to their strength, to the love that survived that night. But for me, the water holds no joy anymore. I can't swim, can't face the pool. The memory of that night, a scar that lingers, a fear that keeps me on land, a reminder of the terror we survived, a reminder of the strength we found, a reminder that some nights leave marks you can never wash away.